Yoma, Dafim Samaches through Ayin Daled. Daf Samaches, beginning of Perek Bolo, discusses the Kohen Gadol's reading of the Torah on Yom Kippur. So the Mishnah discusses how they brought the Sefer Torah. It says, Chazan HaKnesses notel Sefer Torah, Nosno Rosh HaKnesses. The Chazan of the Knesses gave it to the Rosh HaKnesses. The Rosh HaKnesses gives it to the Skan. The Skan gives it to the Kohen Gadol himself. The Kohen Gadol stands and receives it. Omeid Mekabel. V'koreh, he reads, V'achremos, and V'ach Ba'aser. Then V'gol Sefer Torah, he rolls it, Menicha B'cheko, he puts it in his lap. V'omer, he says, Yoser Masha Karasi Lefnechem Kasuf Kan. It actually says in the Torah more than what I've read. And then Ba'aser Shebechomesh HaPekudim, that section, he's Karei Al Peh, he reads by heart. The Yerushalmi has a question on this process. It says that they brought the Sefer Torah, the Chazan, who gave it to the Rosh HaKnesses, and so on and so on. So the Yerushalmi says, B'chol Asarat Amar Holchen Acharat Torah. Everywhere else it says the respectful thing is people go to the Torah. Here you bring the Torah to somebody else. How can you do that? So it says, Elal Yideshin B'nei Adam Gedolim, since there are great people here, the Kohen Gadol, the others, HaTorah Masala Behen, that itself is a cover for the Torah. It's not considered a bizayon for the Torah to bring the Sefer Torah to people, because these people were B'nei Adam Gedolim. Then the Yerushalmi goes on, it says, Hataman Mi'avlin Araisa Gaviresh Galusa, they would bring the Torah to the Reish Galusa. Apparently they weren't always B'nei Adam Gedolim. So it says, yeah, but there was Zara Shal David Meshuka Sham. They were of the Davidic lineage, so that itself is something that allows us to bring the Sefer Torah to them. The Rishonim of Ashkenaz derive from this Yerushalmi a rule that in general we can't bring a Sefer Torah out of its proper place, out of the Aron Kodesh, to an individual. Or Zerua says, if somebody's sick, are you allowed to bring him a Sefer Torah to read from? So he says no. If he's Adam Chashuv, he says, then it's okay. But if he's not an Adam Chashuv, then apparently it's not okay. He says he can bring it from an Adam Chashuv, certainly an Adam Chashuv who's sick and he's an Ones, he can't make it to Shul if he's an Adam Chashuv. But if he's not an Adam Chashuv, apparently you can't. Maram of Rattenberg makes this point explicitly. He says, Bnei Adam, people who are Chavushin V'Veisa Asurim. Maram of Rattenberg himself was a prisoner, captive of the Emperor Rudolph at one point. But if people are in jail or incarcerated, we don't bring a Sefer Torah to them, even on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, because Yerushalmi says we can't do that. It's not respectful to the Sefer Torah. Unless, again, Yerushalmi makes an exception for an Adam Chashuv, but in general, the Zeru and the Marami Rattenberg accept the Yerushalmi that normally you can't bring a Sefer Torah to someone, apparently even if he's an Ones, according to Maram of Rattenberg, he's in jail. Nevertheless, unless he's an Adam Chashuv, then the Zeru says you can do it, but normally you don't bring a Sefer Torah to a private person. The Shulchan Aruch paskins this way, people who are in jail, paskins like the Maram, we don't bring a Sefer Torah to them, even Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. The Ramah gives us a heter. The Ramah says that's only to bring the Sefer Torah at the time of the reading. But if you bring it a day or two before and you give it a new place, this is a new place for the Torah for a day or two before already, that's okay. And if he's an Adam Chashuv, it's mutter anyway, because that's what the Yerushalmi says. For an Adam Chashuv, that's our Mishnah. For an Adam Chashuv, you can do it regardless. Mishnah Berurah says that the Isser to bring it for an individual applies, someone's in jail, it also applies to someone who's sick. Some say no. Some say as long as he's an Ones, that they reject this whole din, that the Yerushalmi's discussion is regarding someone who's not an Ones. Someone who is an Ones, you can always bring the Torah to him. Mishnah Berurah says you can rely on that for things like Parshas Zachar, which is Daraisa, maybe even for Parshas Parah, you can rely on that. If he's not going to hear Parshas Zachar otherwise, you can bring it to someone, even if he's an Ones, even if he's not an Adam Chashuv. The Mishnah Berurah explains this din is based on Zilzal Sefer Torah, because the cover is people should go to the Sefer Torah. Mishnah Berurah says that if there's a minyan, if you bring it to a minyan, if there's a minyan in jail, then it's okay. The Mishnah Berurah goes on, the minhag apparently was, on the Yom Noraim, they often would start a new minyan somewhere else, and they would carry a Torah somewhere else. He says it's not right, because that's the Achronim say it's bizayon for the Sefer Torah. One heter he brings is that if they're going to sell the aliyahs and there'll be more tzedakah, then it generates more money for mitzvah, he says, then staver ein lahachmer. But better, he says, if you can do the Ramaz Eitzah, if you can make a place for the Sefer Torah and bring it there, not just for the laning, but for make a new place for the Sefer Torah for a more significant duration, that's preferable. The eighth of the Ramah is to bring it there a day or two earlier. And the Ramah says, the Mishnah Berurah brings from the Achronim, similarly, if you make a place for the Sefer Torah and you're going to leave it there for another day or two after the reading, that's also good. As long as you put it there in its new place before the landing and you leave it there for a day or two after the landing, you take it out for the landing, put it back, and then leave it there. Because then it doesn't look like you're bringing the Sefer Torah to you for your personal needs to read from. It looks like this is just a new place, temporary new place for the Sefer Torah. Adam Chashuv means, we don't mean he's respected by society necessarily, we mean he's a Gadol b'Torah, because then the Torah is being honored by being brought to a Gadol b'Torah. And some understand even if he's not an onus, that the heter of Adam Gadol is even if he's not an onus. And some say that even if he's chashuv, you shouldn't do it unless he's an onus. It's better to do the Ramah's solution of building a place for the Sefer Torah. The Daf Samach Tes. So the Gemara talks about the different places that you read. You read first from Achremos, then you read from Ach Ba'asar. They're in different places. They're about 7 prakim apart. So the Gemara says there's a rule, medalgin b'navi ve'ein medalgin b'Torah. We can jump, we can skip from place to place when we read Nevi'im, Haftarah, but not when we read the Torah itself, the Chumash itself. You can't do that. So the Gemara says there's a distinction. They used to have a translator who would translate after the Torah was read. They would translate into the vernacular. So while he's doing that, if you can roll to the new place and not have the tzibur wait, because by the time the Turgaman finishes, the Sefer Torah will already be rolled, that's okay. But Kadesh Lo Yafsika Turgaman, if it's too far away and you're not going to finish on time, and the tzibur is going to have to wait there, sit there while the Torah is being rolled, that is not covered at tzibur. That you shouldn't do. Covered at tzibur is an important value, even though it's only a few seconds, possibly it's a minute or two. Nevertheless, covered at tzibur, it's important. The Gemara is going to say this on the next daf as well. The tzibur shouldn't have to sit there while you're rolling the Sefer Torah. Then the Gemara says another rule. The Gemara says, no, but Torah, there's actually a rule that even Kadesh Yafsika Turgaman, you can't be medalig at all. You can never skip in the Torah, even a short distance. So even the few prakim that we skip from the reading of Yom Kippur, from Achremos to Ach Ba'asar, even that should be Asar. So the Gemara says, another distinction, kan binyan echad, kan b'shnei inyanim. That when it's the same topic, when it's the same theme, you can skip at least a short distance in the Torah, when there's no tircha de tzibura. But when it's shnei inyanim, when it's two different topics, then you can't skip at all. Rashi explains that, Mishnah Berurah brings this, that the issue is, the difference between Torah and Navi is Torah you don't skip at all, because Torah is halachas. You have to concentrate, you have to focus on what the Torah is telling you. So if you jump, and then it's a different inyan, even if it's relatively nearby, it's a different inyan, people will have trouble understanding what the Torah is telling them to do. It's Azharis, you have to listen to it. Nevi'im is different. Nevi'im is not Azharis generally, so it's not as important if the people are a little bit disoriented, because they're not going to misunderstand the halach. So this is how we paskin. The Shulchan Aruch says medalgin b'navi ve'ein medalgin b'Torah. You can skip in Navi but not in Torah. That's only b'shnei inyanim, because people get confused. If you jump in the Torah from two different inyanim, then that's a problem of confusion. But b'chad inyana, when it's like Achremos and Ach Ba'asar, which are all about Yom Kippur, that's okay, because that's all in the same inyan. However, there's also a concern about covered tzibur, because in Navi you can skip from one inyan to another inyan, but still you have to worry about covered tzibur. But as long as the tzibur is not going to have to wait and just not do anything while they roll the Torah. The Mishnah Berurah explains, he brings Rashi, that the reason we're concerned about confusion in the Torah is because it's Asharis. And then he says, Mishnah Berurah also adds that the poskim say that today we don't have to worry about Benavi jumping, where we're going to have to roll the Torah. We roll the Navi, we don't have to worry about jumping from different parts of the Navi, he says, because today we have everything is written down in the Haftarah books or in the Chamashim, he says. A person could just mark them off, and a person could just quickly flip from one to the other. It's not like back then where they had scrolls of Nevi'im, they would have to roll, they would have to wait. So today it's mutter, even in two Nevi'im, even when they're in different places, you don't have to worry about it, because everything is in the Chamashim. In some shuls today, they have begun to use Nevi'im again, that you have to roll, written on cloth. So then the concern might be a problem again. If you have to roll from one to the other, then there might actually be a problem again. Daf Ayin, the Gemara goes on and talks more about this covered at tzibur thing, this covered at tzibur issue. The Gemara says that there was a third section the Kohen read. The first two sections he read were the Gemara explains Achremos and Ach Ba'asar, both in Vayikra. There was a third section that he read that Ba'asar, also by Yom Kippur, he read that from Chumash Bamidbar. Chumash Bamidbar, he would read Baal Peh. Why? Why couldn't he roll that as well? Why couldn't he roll that? So the Gemara says, Ein Gol and Sefer Torah B'tzibur. We don't want to have to roll the Sefer Torah B'tzibur because of Kabbalah Tzibur. For them to have to sit there while the Torah is being rolled is not appropriate. Shulchan Aruch paskins this way. Also, Ein Gol and Sefer Torah B'tzibur. We don't roll a Sefer Torah B'tzibur because of Kabbalah Tzibur. If they only have one Sefer and you have to read in two different places, then you have no choice. You do roll the Torah and you have to override Kabbalah Tzibur. The Kabbalah Tzibur is for them to sit there and just wait and be doing nothing. That's a violation of Kabbalah Tzibur. However, if there's no choice, the Shulchan Aruch says then you do it. The Mishnah Berurah explains it's a chiddush. We might have said that do as they used to do on Yom Kippur. They can read a Baal Peh or from a Chumash. So the reason we don't say that is because mistama hatzibur mochen al kvodim. The tzibur, as much as they would rather not be disrespected and have to sit there and twiddle their thumbs while the Torah is rolled, they would also rather have the laning done properly from a sefer. So when you have to go to maftir and the maftir is somewhere else, if there's no choice, you have to roll the sefer. The tzibur is mochel. Why wasn't the tzibur in the Beis Hamikdash mochel for the Kohen Gadol to read ba'asr shel chomesh hapekudim Baal Peh? I'm not sure, but our minhag in Mishnah Berurah, the Shulchan Aruch and the Mishnah Berurah say is that we assume the tzibur is mochel. So ideally we don't do it. Ideally we take care. We have multiple Sifrei Torah, or if we can, we roll in advance. But if you can't, there's only one sefer and the two readings are far apart. We assume the tzibur is mochel and you roll the Torah. On Daf Ayin Aleph, the Gemara brings psukim in Yecheskel. Ravina brings a pasuk in Yecheskel, Pare Pishtim Yu Al Rosham, that they would wear miters, hats on their heads, and the trousers would be made of linen as well. So that's what we see. So we see from there that in Pishtim we know Pishtim certainly is linen. So when the Torah uses the word sheish and bad for the garments of the Kohen Gadol, for those same garments, that's how we know that they refer to linen. Rav Ashi raises an objection. Rav Ashi says, you're learning from Yecheskel, you're trying to understand the Torah based on psukim in Yecheskel. Before they had Sefer Yecheskel, before Yecheskel came along, how do they know what the Torah meant? So the Gemara says, well, Ulu Tamech. Another drasha from Yecheskel. Rav Chisda said about a certain din, Dover Zemi Taras Moshe ben Lo Lamadnu, Midivri Yecheskel ben Buzi Lamadnu. A certain halacha the Gemara brings, we don't have a clear proof from it from Taras Moshe, from the Chumash. We have to learn it from Sefer Yecheskel. The din is Kol ben Nechar Arel Lev Arel Basar Liyavu El Mikdashi. That an Arel Lev or an Arel Basar, someone who's uncircumcised or is uncircumcised of heart, can't enter the Mikdash. So you learn that from Yecheskel. It doesn't say that in the Chumash. Before Yecheskel came, so where did it come from? You have to say, regarding both these points, that until Yecheskel came, it was Gemara Gemirila, it was an oral tradition. Yecheskel recorded it in writing. So here also, that's what we say about this Arel Basar and Arel Lev and the Mikdash, and here also regarding the question of how to interpret Pishtan and Bad and so on, and Sheish. So until Yecheskel came, they had to rely on an oral tradition of what these things were. Yecheskel came and recorded it in writing. The Ramban, in his Hasagas to the Sefer Mitzvahs of the Rambam, makes a very important point based on this language of Ad Mikami Yecheskel Man Amar, which appears in other places in Shas as well. The Ramban is dissenting from a position of the Rambam. The Rambam says that anything which we find in Nevi'im is always midrabban. The Rambam is discussing what we count in Tarek mitzvahs and what we don't. The Rambam says we only count mitzvahs daraisa, and anything that's in the Sifrei Nevi'im is drabban. Ramban says I don't agree. Ramban says it's true that there are many things that the Nevi'im instituted, takanos, minhagim, that they instituted that are drabbanan, like Shlomo HaMelech is Eruvin, Netilas Yadayim is Drabanan. Other halachas he brings are Drabanan. Certain Shvusin of Shabbos, Isurim Drabanan of Shabbos, Ezra and Beis Dino instituted those things. Moshe Tikkun Lehem Yisrael, even Moshe himself instituted for Yisrael the minhag of the halacha of studying the laws of Yom Tov, 30 days of Binyana Shel Yom Hilchas Pesach B'Pesach, Hilchas Teres B'Teres, not 30 days necessarily, but studying the laws of Pesach on Pesach, Shavuos on Shavuos, Chag and Chag. However, the Ramban says it's true that things that are recorded or that we derive from drashas in the Nevi'im are only going to be midrabanan. However, the Ramban says anything written in the Nevi'im as a tzivui, as a halacha, the way the Torah writes that do this, don't do that, thou shalt and thou shalt not, that he says is Dvar Torah. How can that be? How can something that's written in Yecheskel be a Dvar Torah? Yecheskel is not Moshe Rabbeinu, it's not the Chumash. How can that be midaraisa? So the Ramban says because we have a famous rule, Eila ha-mitzvahs, the Gemara says, these are the mitzvahs, only the ones Hashem told Moshe. A Navi is not allowed to innovate new mitzvahs. So anything that a Navi said regarding mitzvahs HaTorah, not just a harasha or a takana, anything a Navi said where he seems to be discussing bona fide halacha and not making a new takana, we know that it must have been a Masorah, which wasn't written down until he came along. When the Navi says, this is the halacha, you must do this, he can't make that up himself. He can't make new halachas unless he's making it takana d'Rabbanan. He has no right to extend the Torah itself. So it must be that if we see something in the Navi as a tzivu, it must be that they had a Masorah, which the Navi first recorded. And that's what he says the Gemaras mean when they say, Ad da'asi Yecheskel man amra. How can it be? Yecheskel can't have made this up himself. Ein Navi Rashai l'chadish. It must be there was a Masorah. That's what the Gemara means, and therefore the Ramban says that when a Navi teaches halacha, it's daraisa, not because the Navi has the right to create halacha daraisa or extend the Torah, but because when the Navi says it, precisely because of that, precisely because the Navi has no authority to add to the Torah, therefore it must be he was simply recording a pre-existing tradition. On Daf Ayin Beis, the Gemara brings a pasuk, a well-known pasuk, Pikudei Hashem Yisharim Mesamchei Lev, the precepts of the Lord are upright and they gladden the heart. The Gemara has a contradiction. Imras Hashem Trufa. Trufa doesn't sound like Simcha. Trufa sounds like it purifies. It could be a painful and stressful process. The Gemara brings a couple of resolutions. Zacha Misamachto, Lo Zacha Tzarafto. If you're Zacha, then it's Misamech. I'll call upon him. The pasuk says, Pikudei Hashem Yishar Mesamchei Lev, Divrei Torah gladden a person's heart. This is the reason that we don't study Torah on Tisha B'Av or when someone's an Avel, because then the mitzvah hayom is a person should not be in a state of simcha, and Torah places a person in a state of simcha. Pikudei Hashem Yishar Mesamchei Lev. The Gemara says it depends whether you're zocha or not, but l'halacha we say that you shouldn't be learning Torah on Tisha B'Av. You're not allowed to learn Torah on Tisha B'Av, or an Avel can't learn Torah because it would gladden his heart. There is an exception. We do learn Torah of Dvarim Haraim. We learn stories about tragedy, about the Churban. We learn halachas about Tisha B'Av, about Avelos, those things we're allowed to learn. Some say it's even a mitzvah to learn those things. Some say maybe it's not a chiyuv, but it's a rishus. But it's certainly mutter to learn Dvarim Haraim, parts of Torah which are not joyous. So the Achronim ask, it's true that they're about sad things. They're about massacres of Jews and destruction of the temple and the laws of Avelos and so on, and Nidui. But Torah itself, it's still Pikudei Hashem, it's still Mesamchei Lev. So why are you allowed to learn it? The Aruch HaShulchan says, you're right. He says, of course Torah is always Pikudei Hashem Yishar Mesamchei Lev. But when the Torah is about something sad, then the sadness that your soul gets from studying something sad, that outweighs the joy that the Torah always gives to your nefesh, and on balance, the sadness is dominant, and therefore you're allowed to learn it. But of course there's simcha. Nevertheless, the sadness outweighs the simcha. Because of this, he dissents from a position of the earlier Achronim. The earlier Achronim, Magen Avram and others, say that even when you learn Dvarim Haraim, the laws of Tisha B'Av, or the stories of the Churban, even when you learn Dvarim Haraim on Tisha B'Av, you can't learn them analytically with kasha and teretz, because that's enjoyable. That's enjoyable, he says, that you can't learn drush or kasha and teretz, because that gives you joy to figure something out, to think of something interesting. Aruch HaShulchan disagrees. Aruch HaShulchan says, Torah always gives you joy. Pikudei Hashem Yishar Mesamchei Lev. You're allowed to learn Dvarim Haraim because the tsar outweighs the joy. He says so. The same thing applies to learning with kedushim and so on. But the tsar of the tzara outweighs that, just like it outweighs the standard joy of the Torah. It outweighs the joy of the kasha and teretz as well. So that's fine. He says he actually inclines toward leniency, that it doesn't matter if there's joy of thinking of something intriguing, because there's always joy in learning Torah. Pikudei Hashem Yishar Mesamchei Lev, but the tsar outweighs the joy. Rav Soloveitchik said something similar, a little bit different. He also points out that Torah study always results in joy. He says the reason it's mutter is not like the Aruch HaShulchan says because the tsar outweighs the joy. He says it's mutter because that's the avodas hayom. The avodas hayom is avelos. One way to do avelos is by studying Dvarim Haraim. So Chazal didn't aser that kind of Torah, even though it has joy, because that is the avodas hayom. And therefore, he also says, like the Aruch HaShulchan, that he wants to be lenient about learning be'iyun, because again, that enhances the fulfillment of mourning on Tisha B'Av. The Aruch HaShulchan makes this point as well. He says if you look in the Maril, then the Maril also says that if you're ma'ayin into the Seder Hayom, into the Dvarim HaRaim, then you have more tzar because you're thinking about it more intensely. So both Aruch HaShulchan and Rav Soloveitchik are more lenient about learning even b'derech iyun. Other Achronim, like Avraham, Mishnah Berurah, I think, are machmer, but some Achronim, the Aruch HaShulchan and Rav Soloveitchik, were more lenient. We have the next parak. This is the parak which is actually most relevant to Halacha L'Maisa, where most of the poskim talk about. This is on Daf Ayin Gimel, the parak of Yoma Kippurim. This is the parak that finally moves away from the avodah of Yom Kippurim and discusses the mitzvahs of Yom Kippurim that we still practice today, beginning with the Isurim of Achila, Shtia, Rechitza, Sich, and Nilas Sandal, Tashma Shamita, what we call the 5 Inuyim, the 5 things that are prohibited on Yom Kippur. The Mishnah then lists a few exceptions. It says, V'hamelach ve'akala, a king and a bride are allowed to wash their face. V'hachaya, a woman who has given birth, Nilas Sandal, is allowed to wear shoes. Different Rabbi Eliezer, that's what Rabbi Eliezer says. The Chum Ostrom. The Chum say no such exceptions, they are prohibited. We actually paskin like Rabbi Eliezer. We paskin Kala, how long is she a Kala? 30 days after the wedding is allowed to wash her face. Shlot is gan al baila, because otherwise she may become repulsive when her husband sees her. Chayadim says that was back then. They weren't in shul all day, so the couple would be together, so she couldn't afford to be repulsive to him. He doesn't see her all day. He's in shul all day. They're both in shul all day. He's in shul all day. Then he says, we're not lenient because there's no need to be lenient. We also pass in the other leniency of chaya, a woman who's delivered. For 30 days she can wear shoes, and other sick people as well, even though there's no danger. Shulchan Aruch says even though there's no danger, there's a heter. We pass in like Rabbi Eliezer that we have these leniencies. There's a major machlokes rishonim whether the Chamisha Inuyim are all daraisa or not. Everyone agrees that not eating and drinking is daraisa, it's a chi of karis. The other ones, the Gemara is going to say there's no chi of karis for them, but there's a question as to whether they're asur daraisa just without the penalty of karis, or whether they're only isurim midrabanan. The Gemara brings drashas. It's not entirely clear if the drashas are daraisa or asmachta. So Tosfos and the Rosh argue that the drashas are asmachta, and the Rosh brings the read that these dinim are not daraisa. They bring a number of arguments in support of this position. One of them is from these dinim of the Mishnah. The Mishnah carved out exceptions for a melech, for a chaya, for a kala. How can you make exceptions? If they're daraisa, we can't make exceptions for these things. So it must be they're drabanan. Midrabanan, they can carve out exceptions. And the Rosh points out, we can't be talking about sakana, because then the Chum wouldn't disagree. We must be talking about there's no sakana. That's what we pass in Shulchan Aruch, that these exceptions are even when there's no sakana. How can there be an exception if there's no sakana? It must be it's only drabanan. What about the other Rishonim? There are other Rishonim who say that all the Inuyim are daraisa. So how do we explain why, how can they make exceptions for Kala, Melech, and Chaya? So I saw Rav Dov Lior explains that he brings a well-known idea that the Isurim of Yom Kippur are only b'derech inui, or only not to do these things b'derech tainuk. Food is asur regardless. Food you can't eat even if it's tasteless and it's still asur. If it's food, it's food. But the other inuyim are only derech tainuk. That's why we can wash your hands when you go to the bathroom and so on, because that's not rechitza derech tainuk. That's rechitza for tefillah, for the mitzvah, or to remove dirt from your hands. So Rav Lior says that these people as well, the melech, the kala, shlotas gan al baila, that's not considered rechitza derech tainug, or if the people who are sick, the chaya or the other people who are sick, that's not derech tainug. So that's mutter for everything except food. We're makil on the other inuyim, even though they're midaraisa, as long as they're things that are not derech tainug. On Daf Ayin Daled, the Gemara goes through various drashas how to interpret the pasuk of v'ini ta'anuas nafshosechem, you shall afflict your souls. That's v'inisim nafshosechem, that we're obligated to conduct ourselves in a manner of inoy, of affliction. That's the source for the various prohibitions of not eating and drinking and the other inuyim if they're daraisa on Yom Kippur. The Gemara says, how do we know? How do we know that's limited to these 5 things? Maybe a person should deliberately sit in the sun and be uncomfortably hot, or sit in the shades and be cold and in order to suffer pain. Talmud Lomar, no, even though the Torah never defines exactly what Inui is, we have a drasha that tells us that those types of activities are not mandated by Inui. What's the drasha? Because the Torah also says, V'chol malacha lo sasu. 2 things about Yom Kippur. Have Inui and don't do malacha. Just like malacha is sheva al taseh, the commandment is passively not to do malacha. So to Inui, it's not to do things like go into the sun. It's passively, it's not to eat and not to put on shoes. It's passive. It doesn't mean sit in the sun. There is an interesting question in the Achronim, though, later Achronim especially, the last century or two. Is there actually a mitzvah to have affliction on Yom Kippur? Not the sin of the sun, but let's say not eating. Let's say a person can find a way not to eat without suffering. For example, he takes drugs or injections or ingested drugs that will reduce his hunger pangs, or will have a slow release capsule that will release nutrition into his body on Yom Kippur. He won't actually feel hungry. He won't feel the affliction of hunger. Is that mutter or not? Can you do that or not? So Shlomo Zalman Auerbach argues it's not in the spirit of the halacha. That certainly says that is, if someone does that, he is a novel b'reshus haTorah. Someone who looks for tricks and stratagems, vitamins, infusions to avoid or alleviate the hunger pangs is like a novel b'reshus haTorah, and he's not better than that. Other Achronim, though, debate this question. Some say it's okay. And one of the ways of looking at the question is there actually a mitzvah to suffer inui, or is inui just a way of saying don't eat? When the Gemara says you might have thought inui means sit in the sun and be hot. No, that's not what inui means. Inui means doing certain passive things. But some poskim argue, or Menashe Klein argued, you see from that there's no mitzvah to deliberately have inui. The mitzvah just requires b'sheva al tasa that you don't eat, and therefore as long as you don't eat on Yom Kippur, that is fine. The question goes back to the Sdei Chemed. The Sdei Chemed said the Sdei Chemed brings that from an Achron of a century and a half ago, Rabbi Menachem Nassim Auerbach of Yerushalayim. He said that actually you should not do this. That included in the commandment of Inui is, if he was talking about not drugs but skulos, you do different things that you shouldn't feel the fasting, then that's wrong. He says it violates the mitzvah of Inui. He says it violates the mitzvah of Inui, even though he grapples with the fact that the Torah said you should eat on Erev Yom Kippur. There's a mitzvah to eat on Erev Yom Kippur, and some say you should eat in order to have strength to fast. How is eating on Erev Yom Kippur to have some food in your system to make it possible to fast? How is that different from skulos or pills or whatever? So he grapples with that. He struggles to explain the distinction, but he says it's different, and he says that he's convinced that skulos on Erev Yom Kippur is wrong. That actually violates Inui. Other posts can go back and forth on this also. The Tzitz Eliezer, the Halachos Yaakov, Tzitz Eliezer goes back and forth, brings a Zohar who talks about Inui, but the Tzitz Eliezer concludes that Tzitz Eliezer concludes that it's mutter, you're allowed to take these pills. He brings the Halachos Yaakov, you're allowed to take pills, he says, by slow release something or others that will work to alleviate hunger, he says. On Yom Kippur you're not doing anything, that's fine. As long as on Yom Kippur you don't eat, what you did Erev Yom Kippur doesn't matter, and that is fine. So some posts can take this position. Rabbi Menashe Klein, Tzitz Eliezer, Halachos Yaakov, and Rabbi Menashe Klein, they all say that Inui of the Torah is satisfied as long as you don't actually eat on Yom Kippur. Whatever you've done Erev Yom Kippur to manipulate your system so you don't feel hungry on Yom Kippur is fine. Other poskim felt it was actually Asur, or at the very least, novel b'reshus haTorah. This Rabbi Menachem Nassim Auerbach of Yerushalayim, he felt that it was wrong. The Pashtus of the Cry says the Chol HaNefesh Asher Lo Seuna Hu Chiyuv Lios Ba'inoi. The Torah does want you to suffer Inoi. He says, how can you possibly do something that is at cross purposes to that to eliminate the Inoi? And similarly, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says it might not be strictly Asur. He says, but he says it's a novel b'reshus haTorah. He brings earlier Achronim. The El Yerabah says that a person shouldn't eat too close to the night, shouldn't eat more than that. He says that on other fast days, he says a person shouldn't eat too much because there's no mitzvah to eat. Erev Yom Kippur there is a mitzvah to eat, so a person does have to eat. He says, but he says that there is a mitzvah. He says, but Al-Kol Panim Shlomo Zalman did fail. Putting aside the question of whether the mitzvah to eat on Erev Yom Kippur and other fast days, but L'maaseh Shlomo Zalman held that doing tricks beyond simply eating on Erev Yom Kippur, that someone who is it's true that someone who's healthy says, and it's a mitzvah to eat more than the regilos. He says it is mitzvah to eat more than usual, and even infusions, he says, is not asur. He says, but that much is novel b'reshus haTorah. But he says someone who's a chola, he says that that he thinks is mutter to take vitamins Erev Yom Kippur, and even on Yom Kippur he says you could take vitamins themselves. So on Erev Yom Kippur do whatever you want. Eating is actually a mitzvah, and the vitamins is technically mutter or novel b'rishus Torah. That's when somebody's healthy, he says. But someone who's sick, he says that even eating shloka derech achila is mutter. He says even eating in an unusual way, and certainly you can take vitamins erev Yom Kippur, and even on Yom Kippur, he says if it's not real food, he'd be able to take the vitamins to help him fast. Rosh Shlomo Zalman did seem to think that at least for a healthy person, that using infusions and vitamins to avoid the discomfort of fasting, he said it's not worth a novel b'rishus Torah, but he did seem to feel that it is sort of novel b'rishus Torah, and he didn't think it was the most appropriate thing to do.